Hello, everyone. Welcome. And thank you for joining us today. I just want to quickly note that the symposium will be recorded. So links to the recording will be shared and posted on our website and our email list. So I just wanted to start with that. And also, I wanted to just really quickly, before we jumped into our speakers, give a quick overview of the Opioid Industry Documents Archive, or OIDA, which is a digital archive that was co-created with the University of California, San Francisco, and Johns Hopkins University. And it contains millions of documents from the opioid industry that shed light on the root causes of the opioid crisis. So OIDA currently contains 13.7 million pages within 30.2 million documents. And some of these include things like company emails, presentations, sales spreadsheets, and many, many more different types of documents. And again, they all provide some insight into the corporate practices that help shape and produce the opioid crisis. In addition to the archive and the documents and research guides that will help people navigate the collections, the OIDA team is creating a number of resources to help with further exploring, teaching, and mining the collections in OIDA. For example, the OIDA curriculum library includes lectures and in-class exercises for the use in undergraduate and graduate classrooms. And we will soon be publishing online an interactive timeline that tells the story of the opioid epidemic through the documents contained in the OIDA's collections. Also, really quick thank you to all of our collaborators and folks who have made the OIDA collection possible, and many of them are listed here. Now, that said, it gives us great pleasure to introduce today's session and our host of wonderful speakers that we have with us. So for this final set of talks today, we are bringing together historical and sociological perspectives that will help us think of novel ways to engage with the materials and topics found in the OIDA's collections, and how this interdisciplinary approach can further facilitate new avenues of research that surround this particular topic, the opioid crisis. We begin today's session with a keynote by Dr. David Courtwright. Dr. Courtwright is best known for his research on the history of drugs and addictive behaviors. He has also written on social, political, and policy history, and has taught medical US and world history at the University of North Florida, where he is presidential professor emeritus in the Department of History there. His most recent book, which is great, The Age of Addiction: How Bad Habits Became Big Business, is a history of global limbic capitalism. He is currently researching and writing a history of the opioid crisis. Other publications of Dr. Courtwright include Force of Habit, Drugs and the Making of the Modern World, and Dark Paradise, A History of Opioid Addiction in America. We will then hear from Dr. Antoine Lentacker. Dr. Lentacker is the Assistant Professor of History at the University of California, Riverside. His research interests include the history of drugs and the pharmaceutical industry in Europe and the US. Dr. Lentacker began advocating for the public disclosure of opioid documents in the summer of 2019, when he drafted an amicus brief that called for the inclusion of broad transparency provisions in any settlement of the ongoing opioid lawsuits. For our final speaker today, we will hear from Dr. Liz Chiarello. Dr. Chiarello is an associate professor of sociology at St. Louis University. She conducts research in the intersection of healthcare and law. Her research centers on how cultural forces such as law, politics, and organizational policy influence decision-making in healthcare and the criminal justice system. Dr. Chiarello's current research centers on the US overdose crisis, where she examines how the fields of healthcare and criminal justice have used shared surveillance technologies to address the crisis and how how doing so has changed professional work and undermined patient care. Helping facilitate our session today, both in transitioning between speakers, but also our conversation when we have at the end, is Dr. Cecília Tomori, who is the Associate Professor and Director of Global Public Health and Community Health at the Johns Hopkins School of Nursing, with a joint appointment in the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I just want to also quickly note before I kick it to David that the full bios of all the speakers can be found on the symposium's website. And finally, if you have any questions, please be sure to enter them in the Zoom Q&A interface that we'll be using at the end, and hopefully we'll get to as many of them as we can. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce David and give the floor to him. Thank you all.
So thank you, Jason, again, and welcome to the symposium. My background is in history. I am writing a history of the opioid crisis. What I want to do today is to give you a kind of jet airplane trip over the history, not only of the opioid crisis, but the events that led up to it, and also talk about the very rich resources that are available in the opioid industry documents archive, and some other sources that you may be interested in consulting. So let's see. We will get these slides to advance.
Yeah, that chat got brought up. So if you can
bear with us for 1 second, please. There we go. So let me start off by saying that this is not the first opioid crisis in American history. Most of you know, I think, that in the late 19th and the early 20th century, there was an opiate addiction crisis that drew a lot of attention, both in the popular press and in the medical profession, that the most common type of addict in the late 19th century was a native-born, middle-class female who was typically addicted iatrogenically and most often addicted to morphine. And the initial exposure to morphine came from her physician because she sought help for dysmenorrhea, painful childbirth, any number of painful conditions. And this created a large wave of addiction in the late 19th century. And there was a pretty strong response to this, both in the profession and in government. And it led to a debate, and the debate led to something that I call narcotic conservatism. So this debate really picked up momentum around 1870, and it focused on the use of opioids, and here's the tie to the present, the use of opioids, or what were then called opiates, to treat chronic non-cancer pain. It was understood that if a person was in the last stages of life, that the use of opiates wasn't entirely appropriate. But what about other kinds of conditions? Were doctors simply masking symptoms that were otherwise diagnosable and treatable? What about the risk of addiction? What about not only the risk of addiction, but the risk of overdose, infections related to hypodermic medication? What about the effects on opiate-dependent newborns? What about the moral effects? There was a lot of attention paid in the Victorian era, as one might imagine, to the effect of long-term opioid use on character and behavior. So, long story short, that debate was resolved in favor of the conservative position. And that position grew stronger over time and indeed was institutionalized, not only in laws and regulations, but in medical curricula, which emphasized that opiates were to be used for the dying, for shock, trauma, post-operative situations, but for little else. And again, my shorthand terminology for that is narcotic conservatism. And that essentially reigns from the end of the 19th century through the 1980s, and in fact, in some places, well into the 1990s. All right, so why is this important? Because it greatly reduced the prevalence of narcotic addiction in the United States. And if you look, for example, at a well-known book edited by John Ball and Carl D. Chambers called The Epidemiology of Opiate Addiction in the United States, published in 1970, they, with the help of another epidemiologist, ascertained that there were, give or take, about 100,000 opiate addicts in the United States in 1967, and the vast majority of these were heroin addicts. In other words, their condition was of non-medical origin. Now, of course, there were medical addicts, but there was nothing like the wave of medical addiction that the country had experienced in the late 19th century. That was something that despite all the drug control problems the country had in the mid-20th century, that was really not a big issue. But boy, things changed by the early 21st century. So fast forward the tape to 2016, the director of NIDA, Dr. Nora Volkoff, is testifying before the Senate. She points out that, well, we've got 2.5 million addicts now, and roughly 4 out of 5 of those people with opioid use disorder are using prescription opioids. So there's this huge increase, and the biggest part of this increase is tied to prescription opioids. Here you see the same phenomenon in graph form. There is a big increase beginning in the mid to late 1990s in per capita opioid consumption, and there are corresponding increases in deaths related to opioids and also admissions to treatment programs for opioid use disorder. If you then go to the 2010s, and I think most of you know this, there's another change as prescription opioids become more expensive, more difficult to source. People who are daily dependent users start shifting to other forms of opioids, notably heroin, then heroin mixed with fentanyl, and finally products that are more or less pure fentanyl, hence the 3-stage epidemic as the CDC has branded it. So the question is, how did all of this happen? And it's an especially interesting question, given that the country had gone through this before. You know the expression, once burned, twice cautious? Well, we weren't. We had gone through this. We had created a narcotic control regime that, at least when it came to medical addiction, was relatively effective, not for non-opioids. I'm not talking about Valium and all of that, but when it comes to opioids, the control system, insofar as it applied to prescription opioids, was relatively effective in the mid-20th century until it wasn't. And so what changed? How did we reverse course so dramatically? And I want to emphasize that the opioid industry is not the only player here. It's a mistake just to think, oh, this is all about evil pharma supervillains hoisting this epidemic on the nation. No, there are other players, and they are significant. And one of the most important group of players are those whom I refer to as revisionists, which is simply a shorthand term that means medical professionals and thought leaders who favored the more liberal use of opioids in treating chronic non-cancer pain. And by the late 70s and the early 80s, this group of revisionist physicians had real momentum, and that momentum was coming out of the palliative care movement. So initially, the important reform is to try to do something about better treatment of cancer pain, but that provides moral and political cover for a broader and more ambitious movement, which is to reliberalize the use of opioids for all sorts of chronic pain. And ultimately what happens, even though that idea does not necessarily spring from the brain of pharma, that idea and its spokespersons are subsidized by pharma, and I would argue to a large extent co-opted by the pharmaceutical industry, certainly by the mid-1990s. However, there is no evidence that as of, say, 1980, 1981, when Dr. Foley is first proposing this idea in OIDA papers, which is subsequently published in 1981. There's no evidence that I can find that she's necessarily supported by the pharmaceutical industry. All right, so once pharma becomes involved, what happens? Short answer, a brilliantly orchestrated campaign to sell this idea, this revisionist idea around certain themes like the scandalous undertreatment of pain, which afflicts such a large percentage of the US population, the idea of opiophobia, that I mean, we've inherited these bad ideas from a benighted past, that we really don't have much to fear if we're using opioids in a medical context. And all of this is designed to get prescribers to embrace more liberal prescribing, to get regulators and legislators to accept it, and also pharmacists, because pharmacists, don't forget, have a corresponding legal responsibility to approve the legitimacy of medical prescriptions. So this is a multifaceted campaign that's aimed at multiple audiences. And Purdue gets it going, but other companies follow suit, even though beginning in 2000 and 2001, you have in the popular press a whole string of stories pointing to some of the dangers of this liberalization of opioid prescribing, increase in diversion, overdose deaths, and so on. So the upshot of all of this is an increase in both direct and indirect opioid iatrogenesis. And I'll explain a little bit later what I mean when I differentiate between direct and indirect iatrogenesis. The OIDA collection is very rich in materials that show how this campaign worked. So here's one quick example. This is from a continuing education program that was put together by a notable Purdue speaker, Dr. Art Lipman, who was a professor of pharmacology, one of the top speakers at Purdue. He's putting this program together for physicians and pharmacists. And back in the day, back in the late 90s, before everything was online, typically if you took a continuing education program, you would read materials, and then after absorbing this material, you would then answer questions as a way of demonstrating that you had in fact read the material and absorbed the information. So the questions will give you the drift. So is drug-seeking behavior indicative or nearly always indicative of addiction? The correct answer here is false. It is not. Another example, what is the risk of addiction if you are dealing with opioids in a pain relief scenario? Answer, extremely low. The correct answer is E, extremely low. And the reference, if you go through the CE, you'll find that all this material is footnoted, and the reference is, no surprise, to the much abused and much misinterpreted Porter and Jick letter in the New England Journal of Medicine, 1980, which became a kind of touchstone for this revisionist teaching. Now, it's not just, of course, the opinion leaders and the continuing education programs. You have the sales force of these various pharmaceutical industries. Here's an example from one of the many copycat companies, Insys, which had a very dedicated and highly motivated sales force, to say the least. These are the case notes of Sonia Palermo, who was one of the more successful Insys sales representatives, and one of her best clients was customers, I should say, was Dr. Alexander Weingarten. And she's using a common gambit, which is the speakers program. She has allocated a budget of speakers fees, which she can dole out to her best prescribers. And for sure, Dr. Weingarten, who, by the way, in addition to being an opinion leader and a popular speaker, is also someone who testifies as an expert witness in cases in which physicians are accused of excessive prescribing. So what she does is she doles out most of her budget for speakers to him. And as you can see, I've used 70% of my speaker dollars. I always get a return on my investment. And that's what this becomes for many pharmaceutical industries by, say, the 2010s. You've got, despite the scandals, despite the problems, despite 15 years of an epidemic, you know, as late as the mid-2010s or even later, you've got companies that are still trying to sell as much of this product as possible, and externalities be damned, they'll be passed on to others. That's not our problem. Did you notice that the second example is not from OIDA, the Palermo notes? And I think maybe the single most important thing I have to share with you today is the knowledge that while OIDA is a great tool, it's not the only tool. So in October of 2023, I inquired and I said, how many documents are there in the MDL, the Multi-District Litigation Database? Answer, more than 51 million documents and related materials. There are currently 3.17 million documents in OIDA. And moreover, there is a kind of a bias in those documents. They deal mainly with the manufacturer cases and with pharmacies like Walgreens. There are relatively fewer, there's still a lot, but there are relatively fewer documents that deal with the pharmacy benefit managers and the distributors. And there's also a chronological bias. With the partial exception of Purdue, most of the production, most of the documents that were produced by the defendants post-date 2000. And a lot of the story actually is centered on the 1980s and the 1990s, because that's when the revolution really occurs. That's when a lot of the key changes are implemented by the pharmaceutical industry, or perhaps I should say with the help of the pharmaceutical industry in collaboration with revisionist thought leaders. However, there's good news. The good news is that the OIDA archive continues to expand. So we'll see more of this other material coming into the online collection. And you can get these documents elsewhere right now. I think this is what's overlooked, is that there are alternative online sources such as DocketBird, or such as what the lawyers call PACER, which stands for Public Access to Electronic Records. And you can find all kinds of material there that's extremely valuable, that's not necessarily yet in the OIDA collection. Moreover, you can follow up leads that you find in one database. You can just do a keyword search in another database, and you'd be amazed at what you come up with. So here's one example. Remember, I showed you all a slide of Sonia Palermo's field notes about Dr. Weingarten, and here you see another version, which is a slide, a PowerPoint slide that she prepared for internal distribution at some kind of reporting session at INSIST. And here she's summarizing her experience with Dr. Weingarten. And you look at this, and it's just bedecked with red flags. You know, what are his hours? Well, his hours are, let's say, generous, from 8:30 to midnight, and he sees more than 40 patients every day. And he's a high volume prescriber of short-acting opioids. He's the #1 writer for multiple drug companies, and so on. It's obvious why she's targeting him. It's also obvious what the problem is. I remember years ago, I had a conversation with Dr. Jerry Jaffe, who was Nixon's drug czar, the first national drug czar when Nixon launched his war on drugs back in the early 1970s. And Dr. Jaffe remarked that the real problem when it comes to illicitly manufactured narcotics is control of outliers, control of outliers. Historically, it's always been the case that 1.5% of physicians will abuse their privileges for mercenary reasons, or maybe to support their own habits. For whatever reason, they'll create a problem. And that problem is a big problem because one person can potentially write a lot of prescriptions. So outlier control was basically the name of the game for decades. But what the pharmaceutical industry does, or at least some pharmaceutical companies do, in the wake of this revolution, this revisionist revolution in prescribing, is to target the outliers. Outliers are no longer necessarily something you want to contain, but a resource that you want to exploit to get, as Palermo said, maximum return on your investment. The archives are very rich in materials that explain the value of opinion leaders. It's a virtual, if you know how to use these documents, it's a kind of primer, really, which will show you exactly what the industry wanted to do with these thought leaders. So, for example, for KOLs, you can have them provide content for your website. They can serve on a pharmacy and therapeutics committee, which will recommend drugs for hospital formularies. They can participate in roundtables, clinical trials, help write guidelines for professional medical associations, and so on. These authors, by the way, were medical liaisons for Purdue, and they decided, oh no, there's an even more lucrative business. Let's go into the KOL recruiting and advising business for the opioid industry. One of the discoveries that I made, thanks to the OIDA files, is that not only were KOLs shared by the pharmaceutical companies, but so were medical writers or ghost writers who are often the brains behind the operation. So just to give you one example, there was a very fine writer, medical writer named Stephen Brown, who ghost wrote responsible opioid prescribing, which is a source that's often discussed in the litigation. It was nominally written by a physician named Scott Fishman. And in fact, I'm sure he did write much of the material, but behind him was Stephen Brown, who was cleaning things up and organizing material and who is acknowledged in the book. And this particular source, which was tied to a CME, was aimed at practitioners. It was financed and distributed by no fewer than 6 opioid manufacturers and half a dozen or more of their front organizations. Well, Brown pops up again when Janssen, which markets Duragesic and Nucynta, wants to get the good news out to older patients and does so in a book called Finding Relief, which he writes. And then he pops up yet again when Purdue and other companies decide they want to spread the gospel to soldiers who are returning from Iraq and other wars. And there is a book called Exit Wound, which is aimed at this particular market. And again, Brown is involved in the production of this. You see, there's a team of rivals aspect of this. With apologies to Doris Kearns Goodwin, I love the phrase team of rivals, because what's really going on here and what you really see in the OIDA documents is competition, but cooperation. So the various firms are competing with one another for market share, but at the same time, they're trying to grow the market. And in growing the market, they will often call upon the same cadre of known opinion leaders, of skilled ghostwriters, of continuing education program designers. They'll share talent. And that's one of the things that you'll find. If you know where to look, the first thing you have to do when you use these documents is figure out who the players are. You have to figure out the language. You have to learn the acronyms. You have to learn who the key players are. And once you've got that, you'll have great success, not only in the OIDA collection, but in the other collections, that I mentioned earlier. Excuse me. So what we have here, really, this is the big picture. What we have here in this collection is a guide to orchestrated pharmaceutical marketing. Not just of opioids, by the way. You'll gain many insights into the marketing of other products as well. And I've come to think of this as the program that you receive when you walk into a symphony performance, and it'll describe the evening's works to be performed, and it will tell you about the conductor, and it will tell you about the musicians in the orchestra. And you can almost think of these documents and the personnel whose views they represent as falling into different parts of the orchestra. So the KOLs are like the string section, the violin section of the orchestra, or the ghostwriters are like the piccolo or the flute. They're small, but they add important notes to the performance. And the sales representatives are like the brass section of the orchestra, and so on. It really is orchestrated. It took a lot of work, not only to market these drugs, which is true of any pharmaceutical product, but it also took a lot of work to overcome the regulatory barriers and to persuade skeptical gatekeepers, of whom there were many at both the state and federal level, that it was appropriate to prescribe these products for chronic non-cancer pain. Okay, so why did pharma do it? Again, the collection is a great guide to this crucial issue. And this is from a McKinsey report, circa 2007, 2008. It shows you the market for analgesics. And if you take a look at this slide, what you see is that for every cancer patient, which is the traditional market for opioid manufacturers, and of course a transient market, in most cases, what you see is that there are 10 patients suffering from chronic arthritis pain, 13 with low back pain. The chronic non-cancer pain market is huge. By 2007, it was more than $14 billion. And by that point, half of all of the prescriptions being written for chronic non-cancer pain contained at least some form of an opioid. So this is the incentive. This is the reason why pharma puts its muscle behind this new revisionist approach to analgesia. All right, so that's the manufacturer story. You may be thinking, why is it that other people are sued, and why is there controversy about these other entities? And that's because they were involved also in the marketing, or allegedly, I should say, allegedly involved in the marketing, which occurred throughout the supply chain. One of the other virtues of the OIDA collection is that it permits you to see how it's not just about Purdue or about Insys or Mallinckrodt or any one of the other defendants, but how this thing works as an integrated system, which one physician, Dr. Joel Saper, called narcopharma. Saper was actually the one who coined the phrase narcopharma. It's an integrated, interlocking system, at least when it comes to marketing. There's another kind of charge that is leveled at the distributors and also the national pharmacy chains, several of which did their own distribution, which is they disregarded the CSA responsibilities, which included providing effective controls to guard against theft and diversion, which specified that they had to create a system, design and operate a system to make sure that suspicious orders were noticed and stopped, and then what was a suspicious order, unusual pattern, frequency, or size, basically. And they didn't do that, and the DEA went after them, especially between 2005 and 2016. And then, of course, the plaintiffs' attorneys went after them on the same grounds later, or I should say the same alleged grounds. And then finally, lobbying, because there's a powerful industry response, which again occurs at multiple levels of the supply chain, which we're cooperating to do things like delay the upscheduling of hydrocodone combination drugs from Schedule 3 to Schedule 2. That lobbying occurs between 2012 and 2014, or the lobbying in 2015 and 2016 on behalf of the so-called Marino Bill, which basically makes it much harder for the DEA to issue immediate stop orders. And if you don't know what an immediate stop order is, that's basically a padlock on a warehouse which closes it down. In the case of companies that are accused of grossly violating the provisions of the CSA. So the upshot of all of this is that a larger percentage of the American population was exposed to prescription opioids beginning in the second half of the 1990s. And this is a heuristic, but you can think of a population as consisting of people who have low susceptibility, as would be true for any disease, and people who have average susceptibility. Those are the A's. The L's are the low. The A's are the average susceptibility. And H stands for people who, for whatever reason, whether it's genetic or social or some combination of the two, have high susceptibility to addiction. And prior to the revisionist revolution, a certain percentage of the population was exposed, either directly through medical prescription or, in the case of diversion, indirectly. Somebody gets a prescription for, let's say, hydrocodone. It's an older patient. A 19-year-old steals some of the pills from Granny's purse and takes them to a party and passes them around, says, this is medicine, it's safe. By the way, it'll get you really high. Try one of these. That's the classic pattern of indirect exposure. So that's always there. It's always there. But what the revisionist revolution does is this. It increases exposure. Now, for some people of low susceptibility, it doesn't matter. They have a tooth extracted and they get some pills and they take a few of them and throw away the rest and no harm done. But for others, there are very significant long-term consequences. All right, so I'll end by just noting that there are a couple of other nice features of not only the OIDA collection, but the larger library, industry library in which it is embedded. And that is, it makes possible comparative analysis of pharmaceutical marketing techniques. So, if, for example, you're interested in pharmaceutical marketing generally, and you realize that many of the techniques that are used to market opioids are used to market, say, antidepressants, all you have to do is look under the other tabs of the industry documents library. And I did a few days ago, I did a search to illustrate this point. So medical writer is a euphemism for a ghostwriter or a behind-the-scenes researcher, someone who prepares a lot of this pro-product material. And surprisingly, there are more hits for the term in the tobacco papers than in the opioid papers. And there are even quite a few hits under the drug and food tabs. So you can see, you can even take the name of a company that, say, specializes in preparing articles and seeing them through to publication, and you can cross-check it among the different industries. And the same companies that work for the opioid manufacturers will often work for other entities marketing potentially harmful products as well. The other bonus I wanted to mention is that even if you're not interested in opioids, the opioid industry document archive is a very, very rich source. If you're a sociologist, if you're an historian of science, medicine, or pharmacy, you'll find all kinds of information in this collection that deals with other drugs. And for example, here's a search or a series of searches for non-prescription opioid drugs in OIDA, which I conducted also on May 6th of this year. And you get all kinds of pertinent documents to drugs like marijuana or heroin or Xanax or alcohol. And there are various reasons for this. For example, the industry is very concerned about competition from big cannabis. Big cannabis realizes that it can market its product as a superior analgesic, which doesn't have the risks of opioid analgesia. So there's all kinds of correspondence about this. Heroin. Well, heroin is a potential blame deflector. You know, don't you know that the real problem is bad people who use bad drugs that are imported by even worse people who work for the evil cartels in Mexico. And so there's this large literature on heroin as well. Likewise, there's a lot of information about allied health professions. This is not just all about doctors and drugs, but you'll find a tremendous amount about the pharmaceutical industry. You will have noticed earlier I used the word deputized or deputy when I was talking about the responsibilities of the CSA. One of the things that federal legislation does is that it assigns responsibility for policing the closed system of narcotic control to many different professions. And in fact, you're going to hear more about that, I believe, from Liz later in the webinar. So as my voice is starting to give out, this would be, I think, a great time to close and to return to the symposium as a whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was a fascinating and incredibly informative presentation. My name is Dr. Cecília Tomori. As Jason mentioned, I will be facilitating the discussion. So let me start off with a larger question, and then I have a whole series of questions that I will raise from the Q&A from the group. So one of my first questions is, you spoke about the previous wave of the opiate crisis caused by iatrogenic means and the fact that we haven't learned from that crisis. And here we are, having dealt with this new, larger scale crisis. I just wanted to ask you a little bit if you could talk about the implications of this lack of learning for the contemporary moment.
Well, I think the important point is we did learn from the previous crisis. And in fact, we institutionalized that learning as a regime of narcotic conservatism. What really happened is that we unlearned. That's what the industry and its allies in the medical profession managed to do. And it really is a remarkable achievement because these attitudes were entrenched. Narcotic conservatism was strong as late as the early 1980s. And in fact, if you go back and look at most of the medical articles that were published in the 1980s, they are not like Dr. Russell Portnoy and Dr. Kathleen Foley's famous 1986 article exploring the possibilities of extending the opioid analgesia to chronic non-cancer pain patients. On the contrary, they are reiterating the conventional wisdom. But what happens is, look, pharma picks its messengers. That's the takeaway message here. Pharma picks its messengers, and you just have to pick the right ones and then run the printing presses to turn out the article reprints and build the websites and create the CME courses and all the rest. And there you go. And then, by the way, sign these people up as speakers and put them on the circuit and get the message out and start funding the American Pain Society and start gaining control over its agenda. And before long, what was a tiny minority view becomes the new conventional wisdom. So this is unlearning the past. It's literally sending historical lessons down the memory hole and then creating this new paradigm or this new conventional wisdom to take its place.
Yep, I hear exactly what you're saying. So learning and then strategic unlearning is, and strategic forgetting is where we are. Before I go to the other big ones over here, do you feel that people in this moment are aware of potentially recycling some of the tactics that you are describing in this, earlier but ongoing wave?
So if by that you mean has there been a kind of heightened consciousness about pharma's bag of tricks as a result of the opioid crisis? I think the answer is yes, at least among people who follow the news, and for sure among the roughly 40% of the American population that now knows of someone, including family members, who have been affected by this crisis in some way. Yeah, I think there's heightened awareness. I sure hope so.
Let's go to some of the questions in our chat. So one of our first ones is fascinating, full stop. Can you speak to the potential oversupply of stimulants like Adderall and Ritalin in the United States? Do you believe this is present? And if so, is it using the same playbook? Should we expect litigation as well?
Good question. Yes, although I myself was listening to a webinar that was run by attorneys, and the next wave of mass torts might even involve things like hyperpalatable foods, which are increasingly seen as having drug-like properties and which are certainly marketed in aggressive ways. But to me, the thing about psychostimulants is that it ties into the CSA. So one of the things that's important to understand is that when Congress enacted the Controlled Substances Act in 1970, most of the debate in Congress is not about opiates. It's not about what were then called narcotics. It's about sedatives and tranquilizers and stimulants. And people have realized that while the government may have done a fairly good job in limiting medical narcotic addiction, it hasn't done a good job in terms of either iatrogenic addiction or controlling diversion with respect to other psychoactive substances. So what you get is this kind of grand reform bill, this omnibus bill, which tries to create a unified, controlled system for all dangerous drugs. And in fact, and almost no one knows this, the original title of the legislation was the Controlled Dangerous Substances Act, which was later shortened to the Controlled Substances Act. And certainly Congress was aware of the overprescription and the diversion of substances like psychostimulants. Did that continue after the enactment of the Controlled Substances Act? Yes. I mean, people are always trying to cut corners and look for loopholes, but to date, it hasn't resulted in the kind of mass litigation that we've seen with opioids.
Another attendee asks, you haven't mentioned race so far, but you've spoken and written about it. Can you speak to race and how you think it may intersect with abatement efforts to the degree that you believe it has or will?
Well, the way that race usually comes up in this story is in the form of an irony, which is that most physicians, especially older physicians, were suspicious of African-American patients, especially in emergency room settings, as drug seekers. And so there's this kind of ironic protective effect, whereas if say in the year 2003, you are a white physician and you've been taught or you've been retrained that in certain contexts it's perfectly appropriate to prescribe these medications for patients with chronic pain, you, at least at the time, you were more willing to do so for a 55-year-old white woman than, let's say, a 21-year-old African-American male. And so that's part of the reason why we have the pattern that we do. Now things have changed, obviously, in the last 5 or 10 years, especially with the surge in heroin and fentanyl. And I think that the fact that all segments of the population are involved in this, if anything, increases the pressure for harm reduction and the provision of good treatment. Politically, I hope I'm not being naive about this, but I think that the more ethnically based interest groups you get concerned about the crisis, the greater the potential for broad across the board action. On the other hand, having said that, I would admit that prejudice has not gone away, and to the extent that people perceive this as, oh no, once again, this is becoming more of a problem of African Americans, that may undercut some of the political support for public health approaches and harm reduction. So too early to say, I think.
Another question is on injunctive relief. So have you followed injunctive relief at all? Do you believe the relief that has been ordered by the courts will meaningfully change the trajectory of the epidemic? Why or why not?
It will change the trajectory. It has, in my view, it has changed the trajectory of the epidemic as it applies to prescription opioids. I mean, it's certainly the case that there are fewer new cases of opioid use disorder acquired through prescription medications now than there were, say, 15 years ago. That's undoubtedly the case. Unfortunately, the prescription opioid addiction epidemic was like the booster stage on a rocket. It's the big booster stage on the rocket that gets the thing launched, and then once it's launched, you've got over 2 million people and they're daily dependent users, and they're going to use something to avoid dope sickness, and that something turned out in the 2010s to be increasingly heroin or fentanyl. And you know, all the injunctive relief in the world isn't going to help a person who became addicted to hydrocodone in 2008, switched to heroin in 2011, and now they're using fentanyl if they're still alive. So, and that's what happened in the late 19th century. So the reason that addiction came down, the rate of addiction came down in this country, was simply we had this huge cohort of addicts that was created essentially between 1870 and 1895, and then they aged, and they either quit using or they died and dropped out of the population. And as that happened, the overall prevalence came down.
Thank you for that. Switching a little bit, what are your thoughts on the role of a consultant like McKinsey, McKinsey played in coordinating marketing strategies between and among pharma firms, distributors, and pharmacies?
I think McKinsey played a crucial role, and what strikes me is that it played the role both early and late. So McKinsey, as you probably know, advised several of the manufacturer defendants, Mallinckrodt and Purdue and Johnson & Johnson, and there were others. And they were advising Purdue until as late as, if memory serves, as late as 2017. That to me is probably the single most disturbing aspect of the opioid crisis. You know, it's a mistake to think that everybody in this had purely bad intentions. I think that some of the early pioneers of this revisionist revolution wanted to do good while doing well. So they genuinely wanted to help people, and they also wanted to sell product, all right? Make money and help people with chronic pain. And there's nothing wrong with that. But once you realize that that experiment has failed, that the risks are far higher and the benefits are far less, then you need to do something. You either need to pull the product or add an antagonist like naloxone, or you need to do something to address the crisis. And yet, as late as 2017, a consultant like McKinsey is helping Purdue to figure out how to sell more OxyContin. We're 20 years into the epidemic by that point. And to me, that is unconscionable.
I wanted to ask you a question about, in terms of the work that you are doing and the way that health professionals are trained, which is often not necessarily in conversation with some of the work that historians and sociologists, social scientists might be doing. Are there some lessons that you have for health professionals who may be listening in, and perhaps those who might train health professionals for how to have these kinds of interdisciplinary conversations that are so valuable that we're having today?
Well, gosh, I may be the wrong person to ask that question. My career has been relentlessly, if not ruthlessly, interdisciplinary. I'm well aware of the limits of the historical method and historical knowledge, and I'm always asking colleagues in medicine, in sociology, in epidemiology, and I'm reading widely in those literatures. Look, frankly, there's no other way to do it. There is no way to get your arms around the opioid crisis from the perspective of a single discipline. And I don't care what that discipline is, whether it's medicine or pharmacology or sociology or anything else. It's the only way to go, and it's the only way you're going to be able to use the OIDA collection effectively. If you're not willing to fire off an email to somebody because you don't understand some terminology or some approaches that are being taken in a document that you're reading, you're not going to get anywhere.
I asked that because you're interdisciplinary. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Obviously,
go interdisciplinary.
in clear agreement with you. Any other sort of final thoughts as we are going to go ahead and transition in a few minutes? Are there some things that you wanted to share with us as we move on to our next speakers?
One last thought, and I'll share it very quickly, which is documents are not enough. So in preparing for this book, I've been conducting oral history interviews with this generation of opinion leaders who led this revolution, this what I call the revisionist revolution, who, by the way, are no longer spring chickens. These are people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. And they're getting on in years, and I'm trying to interview them, and I'm trying to interview all sides. It's important that you not just speak to the people and physicians for responsible opioid prescribing who were critics of the new liberalized approach to opioid prescribing. It's important that you seek out and talk to the people who did advocate for more liberal prescribing. And one of the great things about OIDA is during these interviews, you can just hand a person, an interviewee, a document from, say, 2010 and say, well, you said this back in 2010. What did you mean by this? Can you elaborate on this? What were you thinking when you said that at the time? And I've discovered that people are often fascinated when you give them information about a position or an idea or a concept they were espousing in the past, and what did you mean then? What do you think of that now? How have your views changed? So OIDA is a wonderful research tool that you can use for oral history projects that are tied to this research and pharmaceutical marketing generally.
That is a great way to end. And are these oral history interviews going to be available, or are they going to be part of your book?
Yes, I hope to archive the interviews. In some cases, the interviewees did not give me permission to archive the interview. In other cases, they did. And I hope that these will ultimately, at least the vast majority of them, will be archived. But don't wait for me. Don't wait for the Courtwright Oral History collection. Talk to these folks yourself. And they've been through a lot. This was an amazing thing that happened in their lives, an experiment that kind of blew up and became very controversial. And their names were all over the newspapers and the news media. And I have found that a surprisingly large percentage of the people I have approached have been willing to share this information about this remarkable event in their lives.
Well, Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure listening to you. Thank you, Dr. Courtwright.
You're welcome.
We are going to move on to our next speakers. So as Jason mentioned earlier, we are going to have Antoine and Liz talk us through some next key wonderful discussions. And Antoine, please go ahead and share your slides with us.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Does it look like everyone can see the slides?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Great. Well, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Jason, and thanks, Cecília, for the introduction, and thanks to the OIDA team for the invitation. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be able to speak about my work on and with the documents. You know, as Jason noted, I began thinking about the archive, in fact, even before it existed, and you know, not because I'm an expert on the opioid epidemic. In fact, I'm primarily a historian of medicine and pharmacy in 19th century Europe. But there are two things that led me to this. And so the first is, as David explained, and as David's work is shown better than probably anyone else's, you know, the opioid epidemic is not entirely unprecedented. I mean, it does, in some uncanny ways, repeat, you know, how addictive earlier episodes of, you know, use and misuse of addictive substances, particularly in the late 19th, early 20th century, which is the period I explore in my work. And so just to give one example, David talked about this in detail, but this, for instance, is a prescription from 1902 by a French doctor. And, you know, among the various remedies, one of the remedies prescribed is a cocaine solution. And as you can see from all the stamps that cover the prescription, also all these numbers here, stamped or written on the prescription, are kind of the numbers given to the prescription once it's filled at a pharmacy. And you can see that it was filled and refilled in several different pharmacies, several different cities. And so this is already one record that some of the issues that, you know, have come to light during the current opioid crisis, in fact, have a much longer history and are repeating themselves, though in different forms or different media nowadays. You know, the other thing is that in probing the archives of medicine and pharmacy in the 19th century, I have in fact often wished as a historian that I had access to the exact kinds of documents that OIDA now makes available to historians and other researchers. You know, particularly the corporate records. You know, in the late 19th, early 20th century, some of these are available, have survived, especially, in fact, in the case of the German drug industry, but it's very much, at least in Europe, an exception. There's very little has survived in you know, of that kind of records. And the reason is because, you know, the intense secretiveness that has characterized the drug industry, the contemporary drug industry, in fact, has characterized it from its very beginnings, the very beginnings of the proprietary drug industry, the industry for ready-made brand name pharmaceuticals. And so, you know, already at the time, late 19th century, those records were hidden from the public, and for the most part, they have been lost since. And I should say the same thing is true for prescriptions. You know, I show you one here that is very much an exception. Prescriptions are, for the most part, been lost, even though they are these, you know, wonderful the kind of strategic documents on which all these forces which you know, shape medicine, medical decision-making converge, you know, medical education, medical research, also, you know, starting in the late 19th century, the regulations of health insurance, the habits of physicians, the demands of patients, all of these things somehow, converge or shape or are in some way recorded in those very interesting documents. And yet most of them are lost. I mean, it's very difficult, at least in the places where I've done my work, to find prescriptions. And so, as a result of the unevenness of the archive, I have a keen interest not just with the stories in the archive, but also with the story of the archive. How did my archive come together? What are its contours, its saliences, and its gaps? What is documented and what not? What is preserved and what is lost? What is made visible in the archive, but also what is made invisible in or by it. And to be clear, I don't mean to suggest that it is anything original about me or my research. I mean, in many ways, this is what we call source criticism in history is the foundation of the historical method. Because typically historians rely on documents that have been already created and preserved by others. Others who have their own agendas, who labor under certain institutional constraints, within certain power structures. And so all archives emerge within certain social and political force fields, and an awareness of those force fields, in which archives emerge, which they might also, attempt to transform, is the first step in interpreting them and making them speak truthfully. And so again, that's very much the bedrock of historical scholarship. And so for me, the points where things began to diverge from normal historical work was the point where source criticism became bound up with, what I propose to call source activism. And that's the topic of my remarks for today. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of this archive. From my particular perspective, in order to reflect on this question, to reflect on the opportunities that, and also the challenges that come from working with a hot rather than a cold archive, an archive in the making, rather than one that is already made and preserved and somehow, frozen in place for later use. So how did I reach the point of, sort of becoming interested in this particular archive? Well, given my interest in the history of drugs on the one hand, but also the history of archives, there's one story that always spoke to me, and that's the story of the tobacco documents, which many of you are going to be familiar with. And the story was told in different ways, different places. Perhaps some of you have seen the movie, The Insider, 1999 thriller, which is very much about dramatizing this, the stakes of keeping or spilling corporate secrets. And I've just seen it again recently, and it's kind of striking how, in some ways, it tells the seemingly unchanging story of corporate deception and of the kind of dramas and dilemmas of whistleblowing. In other respects, even though it's not that old, it already very much feels like a quaint historical documents, because, in the 90s, the secrets are still exchanged by fax machines and payphones, and people meet in cars at night, in the dark of night. So I guess that, can certainly see that the technologies of dissimulation and disclosure have already evolved a great deal since that rather recent time period. Now, for me personally, the one thing that really got me interested in the story was a book, the Alan Brand's book on the history of the cigarette, and the book, is a 500-page book, and it covers the sweep of the kind of the history of cigarettes and the whole sweep of the 20th century. And in the 500 pages, really the story of the documents and how the documents, internal documents of the tobacco industry were disclosed only, occupies a few pages, but to me, or as I read it, it very much is the turning point of the story, certainly the point at which the tobacco industry somehow lost control over the narrative, and it kind of opened the floodgates of the kind of reckoning which the tobacco industry had to face in the late 90s and the late 90s mostly. Okay, and so being aware of the history of the tobacco documents, and also since I work on the history of drugs, I couldn't help but wonder why there was such a contrast between the fate of the tobacco documents and the, the documents or the secrets of the pharmaceutical industry. Why? And in fact, the industry documents library, which houses the tobacco documents, about almost 20 years ago now, did create a document, a drug industry documents archive, DIDA, and DIDA preserves some documents from various, cases against the drug companies. I mean, the Neurontin case here was the first one to kind of, seed the archive or lead to its creation. There's been a number of other cases as well. Many of them were mentioned by Dr. Kesselheim in his presentation on Monday. And, the documents are very valuable. They're very interesting, but I believe at this point there's about 6,000 of them. Okay, so it's a huge contrast with the amount of documents that the tobacco litigation has yielded. And, this speaks very much to the success which the pharmaceutical industry has had for a very long time and so keeping its documents secrets and shielding itself from public scrutiny. And so, in this, like the end of the last decade, 2018, 2019 is when the litigation against the opioid industry really started picking up. And, I read about it in the newspapers. Again, I was mostly a historian of the 19th century, but it caught my attention. I did feel that this presented an opportunity that, hopefully the result of the litigation would be that the opioid documents would come out the same way as the tobacco documents had come out, and that they could be put out there online right next to the tobacco documents. And so in the summer of 2019, I drafted an amicus brief to try to make the case that this should happen. I had help from the folks at the Industry Documents Library. I spoke to got some advice from other folks, lawyers, and I drafted a letter. It was signed by more senior people than me, people who had a record and had written about the history of U.S. medicine, which at the time I hadn't done. And it was filed in September 2019 in the district court in Ohio, which oversees the consolidated federal cases, the MDL, litigation, which David referred to. And so, and the point of the brief was to alert the judge, the parties to the precedents of the tobacco documents and try to outline, to articulate a vision of how and why disclosure and archiving should be part of a comprehensive strategy, public health strategy to abate the opioid crisis. Now, I should say, when I did this in 2019, and because I think like a historian, I had a number in mind. The time frame I had in mind was 50 years. I wondered when I wrote the brief, like, what kind of record will historians have to write the history of the opioid crisis, 40 or 50 years from today? And now in this particular context, with this particular audience, I'm aware that this number will seem perhaps somewhat absurd given the urgency of the crisis. I mean, to some degree, it is the nature of historical scholarship. We write about past events once they're over, once the dust has settled, once they kind of have turned cold, with the hope, of course, that a better, more comprehensive big picture knowledge of past events, past crises might, serve as a resource for confronting current or future crises. And to some degree, in the case of the tobacco documents, this was roughly the time frame as well, right? I mean, the tobacco crisis or the peak of tobacco consumption in the US, I think, is reached in roughly the mid-1960s, and there was already litigation going on at the time, not very successful at the beginning, but it started at the time. And really the great historical studies that offer this kind of big picture view of the history of the cigarette in the US or globally, they are rather recent. Alan Brand's book is from 2007. These are some other examples which have been published after. And so, to some degree, this is what I had in mind. This is the time it would take. I didn't know how likely, the kind of proposals we outlined in the brief would be to be taken up by others, be successful. And so my idea was that I would just, I had done this punctual advocacy effort, and I would return to my own work on the history of the 19th century, and that would be it. And I guess, history just kind of caught up with me, or things moved faster than I had expected. On the one hand, with the disclosure of the documents that went faster, better than I had expected in 2019. And credit is due here to the state attorneys general, like Keith Ellison in Minnesota, or Maura Healey in Massachusetts, and others who shared the belief that this is something that should happen. Credit is due also, of course, to the amazing work of the OIDA team, has done so much in so little time to make these documents available. And then the other developments, just a few years ago, was the pandemic. The pandemic, as a historian, who relies on work in European archives, I had to set that work aside for a while. I couldn't travel. Kind of brick and mortar archives that I was used to working in were closed, and it's just the time that OIDA came online. The archive was a digital archive, and it was growing so fast. So that's how I kind of became, at least for a while, a historian or a student of the opioid epidemic. Good, and so this shift really also forced me to rethink the way I do my work as a historian. It is kind of an archive of a completely different nature than the ones I had been using. And, I'm still used to the brick and mortar archives where you clock in the morning. The folks you run into are almost all historians, perhaps your odd genealogists, and then some archivists who are there to help or not, depending. So this was a completely different archive, and it required very different methods to, I think. Okay, and so in the time I have left, I just want to make some remarks about these how OIDA might invite historians to rethink the way they do their work. And certainly the greatest change for me was the collective nature of the enterprise, the interdisciplinary nature of it, as opposed to the archives I was used to, where the usual suspects are going to be historians and archivists. Those folks were involved with OIDA, but OIDA also drew, clinicians and journalists and lawyers and data scientists and, patient advocates and survivors and so on. It was a far more diverse cast of character than I was used to in this typical and sort of the more traditional historical work. Good, and so, certainly for me, or I think for any historian coming to OIDA, the first and obvious challenge is just the sheer size of the archive. It's still a young archive, but as of now, there's 13.5 million pages of documents, 3 million documents, more than 3 million, and more is underway. If the Supreme Court approves the Purdue deal, I read that it could be as many as 30 million documents that might come into play. I know David mentioned that there's now more than 50 million documents in the custody of the litigators in the MDL, the federal consolidated cases. So, these are just enormous numbers. And I think it's clear that this will take something different than the traditional methods of the historian to unlock the full potential of a repository of the size. So we'll need new data tools to navigate this wealth of materials. The OIDA team is at work on developing these. I think it should be clear too that the work of data scientists and AI, machine learning, will almost certainly will have to make a contribution to this. And so as historians, we depend on the work of these other experts. I was not trained to certainly not develop these tools, even I was not trained to use them. So, this will have to be part of how we make the archive count. But on the other hand, I also believe that the dependence, goes both ways, right? And that, however powerful or data processing tools source criticism should remain an essential part of the interpretation of the archive. You know, just as, you know, to make an analogy, as Dr. Kesselheim reminded us on Monday, when you have a clinical study, a clinical trial, you know, to interpret it, you need to know the, you know, the profile of your subject pool, you know, the recruitment and study protocols. You know, you need to know perhaps also who funded the study and why, and, you know, what data are disclosed and what data are not disclosed. And the same principle applies to document archives as well. You know, you cannot interpret them without thinking carefully and critically about the forces that shaped your evidence base. And those, you know, and those are the questions that we as historians are normally trained and equipped to think about. And I do think here that there is the kind of same danger lurking in both cases, you know, in medicine and history, which is that, you know, powerful and sophisticated data processing tools, as important as they are, also create a powerful temptation to kind of take their findings at face value, kind of succumb to an illusion of objectivity, even though no evidence base is ever without its you know, its biases and its gaps, and it's something we need to be aware of. Okay, so the second point of kind of both promise and peril, or, you know, opportunities and challenges, is you know, comes from the collaboration of historians or other researchers with lawyers and journalists. And both lawyers and journalists really have made a decisive contribution to building a record of the opioid crisis. But they too come to this with their particular perspectives. Okay, you know, the stories they tell are more likely to be, most likely, you know, to be those that focus on, you know, to put it simply, the criminal and the sensational. You know, what will interest courts on the one hand and the general public on the other. And that's not a critique, of course, but, you know, simply an acknowledgement that we all come to these stories with different tools, different roles and audiences, all of them essential to the collective work of understanding and narrating the epidemic. But that said, you know, I do think, and it's a point that David was making, I do think that one of the main tasks of us researchers, when we think about the ways that, you know, lawyers or journalists might be coming to the story as well, is to broaden the lens beyond the kind of most egregious examples of law breaking or the most obviously unethical behavior. You know, there was plenty of that in the opioid crisis, no doubt about it. But I feel we would be missing a critical part of the story if we told ourselves that, somehow persuaded ourselves that the crisis was due only to grossly corrupt or deviant behavior in an otherwise sound medical ecosystem. And, you know, there's plenty of also routine behavior fitting squarely in the mainstream of our healthcare system that made the crisis possible or greatly amplified it. And so here is something that, again, point made by David as well, but something we have to realize about OIDA is, you know, however rich and expansive as it is, it also has its biases. And, you know, corporations do not welcome disclosure, and typically they will agree to it if they are compelled to, if they're in a position of weakness, which typically is, you know, if they're in bankruptcy proceeding, that has been a pattern. If they face greater legal liabilities. So those companies whose documents are most likely to end up in the archive tend to be the most troubled ones, the ones that perhaps have most obviously broken the law or have for other reasons attracted the attention of litigators. And so a good example of that, just to give one example, is the case of Mallinckrodt. Okay, so Mallinckrodt is a company that's not nearly as famous or infamous as Purdue, but it was at the height of the opioid epidemic. You know, the height of the prescription, kind of, you know, the first phase of the epidemic. The single largest supplier of opioid pills in the nation. And many of them were generic opioid pills that were diverted in very large amounts, particularly, in fact, through the pill mills of South Florida, you know, about 10, 15 years ago. And so as a result, the company faced a growing wave of lawsuits and filed for bankruptcy. And eventually in 2021, it agreed to a settlement plan that provided for disclosure of its documents. And those documents formed the first really substantial collection to come onto OIDA in 2022, about 1.4 million documents. And Mallinckrodt documents were amassed by lawyers to emphasize all the ways in which the company broke the law. They were used by a team of Washington Post reporters who revealed how the company trained its marketing resources, mostly its drug representatives, on a small number of very high opioid prescribers. Many, all of them, all of the prescribers featured in the article are prescribers who ended up being convicted, in many cases also imprisoned for gross violations of the Controlled Substances Act or for healthcare fraud. So again, typically, the most egregious sort of behavior. And so, having worked on the collection ahead of its release, I wanted to try and also tell us a somewhat different story, stand on the, the work or, that lawyers and journalists had done. But I tried to also do something a little different with it. And so, the concept of drug diversion is definitely a legal category. It refers to those, situations in which a controlled substance somehow spills out of the legitimate distribution channels and ends up in the hands of people who are not intended to receive them, and then also give rise to illicit use. So again, it's it's a legal category. It's a violation of the law, and sort of by analogy with it, I wanted to think about the phenomenon of data diversion, which is not a legal category. It's a term we coined to try to explain or to try to eliminate one of the causes of the scale of drug diversion in the case of the opioid epidemic. And to illustrate what I mean by drug diversion, I have one example here of a document from the archive, and it's a number of emails within Mallinckrodt. It starts at the bottom right here of the page, and so here's an email from Dave Hoffman, who worked at a wholesaler, a drug wholesaler. And so typically when Mallinckrodt sold its generics to wholesalers, it sold them at a fixed price, catalog price, but it granted distributors discounts, which were called chargebacks, and these discounts could be claimed by the wholesaler after it sold the product on to its own clients, the retail pharmacies or clinics. And once it, and to claim this discount, then it had to submit to Mallinckrodt detailed documentation of its own downstream sales. So all the sales it hadn't done to its, to its own clients. And then, so as a result, when drugs flowed down the supply chain from the manufacturer to the wholesaler and then the retail pharmacies or clinics, data kind of went back up from the wholesaler to the manufacturer. And as a result of all those transaction data, there's chargeback data, which the Mallinckrodt received from its wholesalers. It had, in fact, incredibly detailed knowledge of the path of its products, not just, from its own warehouses to those of the wholesalers, but also from the wholesalers all the way down to the point of retail. So a kind of extraordinary visibility into the movements of its own products. And so here it was a 2010 Dave Hoffman, who works at KeySource, which is a wholesaler buying generic opioid pills from Mallinckrodt, tells Mallinckrodt, Victor Borelli, a kind of infamous employee of Mallinckrodt, that they have this one pharmacy in Florida, it's called Pharmco, that's ordering really large amounts of opioids. And they say, do you know just how much product they're sourcing? They're giving us numbers, or they're ordering from us, but implicitly, are they ordering from other wholesalers as well? And why would Mallinckrodt know whether a pharmacy that is not its direct clients was ordering drugs from other wholesalers? Thanks to its chargeback data. Okay, and so Borelli consults in the company. He asks Kate Mullenkamp, a colleague of his who does the kind of runs the databases. She looks into it, and then here you can see on the left at the bottom, she sends this list of 5 different wholesalers from which Pharmco is buying Mallinckrodt's opioid pills. And so at this point, and Borelli forwards that information to Dave Hoffman, says, Dave, sorry about the long delay on this. I think this is what you wanted to know. Review the information and let's talk. And then PS. Okay. So normally at this point, once you see that a pharmacy orders from more than one wholesaler, this is a red flag in a controlled substance distribution, because the one reason why a pharmacy would want to order from more than one wholesaler and split the orders is to get very large amounts of products without kind of attracting the attention of any one of the wholesalers, okay? But again, Mallinckrodt is able to see this thanks to his chargeback data. And so, key source should have cut off the pharmacy at this point. Borelli should have notified all the other wholesalers that this one pharmacy was ordering, splitting the orders. And then the DEA should have been notified. But is this what they do? No, this is not why they're using the data. The data obviously is very valuable to key source, the wholesaler, because it gets intelligence on the business of its clients with its competitors. It might also be useful to cover itself from a possible DEA investigation or enforcement action. For Borelli, it's great too, because he gives the information as a way to firm up the relation with a good client. And then in exchange, actually, this is another document, his colleagues, his contacts at KeySource give him commercial information on, if the wholesaler is considering buying products from competitors of Mallinckrodt. So Actavis was the big, other generic opioid maker, okay? And so this is a great example of how data that are ostensibly produced for the purpose of monitoring the supply chain and ideally also to spot diversion and so to enforce the Controlled Substances Act are in fact recycled by the company for the opposite purpose of evading regulatory safeguard and like boosting sales as much as possible. So this is a little bit the idea of data diversion, which again is not a legal category, it doesn't show up in the legal filings, but the documents in the archive allow us to piece together this one corporate strategy, which was one of the causes or one of the reasons for the scale of diversion. Okay, so third point, and I just offered this as a point of conclusion, is also the need to work with people with a lived experience of the epidemic. And I think it's fair to say that this has been perhaps for the archive, one of the biggest challenges is how to create relationships with survivors, relatives, with activists, in making the archive relevant to these communities. But I think it's also a necessity that we do so if OIDA is going to be a genuinely living repository, living archive. And here's the reason. When I talk about my work with the archive and the efforts to bring the documents to light, to try to reveal new stories, and I talk about this with folks, and the question I always get is, oh, it's very interesting. So what is it that the archive is revealing? What are the new stories you're going to tell with the archive? And I understand the question, and yet to me, it always surprises me, because my instinct is always, or my response is always that, well, I don't know. I mean, if I knew what stories the archive was going to tell, if the archive was only there really to confirm stories that we're already familiar with, then I don't know that it would be worth our efforts. And my hope and my belief is that OIDA is going to be a truly generative archive. I mean, an archive that is going to be used in the future to tell stories that we haven't yet told, that we don't yet suspect. And then, the question becomes, how are we going to discover the stories that need to be told and that haven't yet been told? And I think here that no one is better able to advise us in that respect than people who have this lived experience of the pandemic and who have felt the pain that it has caused, sort of in their full range and diversity. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. We are going to go ahead and transition over to Liz's presentation. You're going to get spotlighted in 1 second. And you're welcome to screen share. Thank you.
Oh, yes. Let me set up that screen sharing. Are you all able to see the slides?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, great. Well, thank you all for being here. It's been really interesting to listen to the symposium over the past couple of days, especially as someone who doesn't use archives in my own work. So I'll be talking more around the archives than through them. But I'd like to go ahead and thank Jason and Caleb for organizing, and Amanda for all of her hard work, and also thank you, Cecília, in advance for moderating. I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. And so just a little bit about me. I'm a medical sociologist and a socio-legal scholar. So I do research at the intersection of healthcare and law. And I've spent the last 15 years studying the overdose crisis through a sociological lens. And I use this as a case for thinking about how the lines between criminal justice and healthcare become blurred. So really thinking about relationships between social fields and how they change over time. So what I like most about a sociological lens is its flexibility. So it can zoom into the fine-grained details of a single doctor making a decision about a single patient. It can zoom out to show the landscape in which that physician practices. And it can swing in an arc to trace historical events leading up to a critical moment in time. It is at its best a complex, multi-layered storytelling device. And this is what makes a sociological perspective so useful for studying something like the overdose crisis. Sociologists insist in examining problems in context and understanding problems in relation to one another. A sociological perspective also nicely complements the work being done in the humanities, public health, and public policy. So today I'm going to talk about the cultural stories that we tell ourselves, the context in which social problems like the overdose crisis emerge, how healthcare's response to the crisis has created new obstacles, and what we can do to make things better. So let's begin by thinking about the stories that we tell ourselves. Americans love a fairy tale. We have digested narratives about good guys and bad guys our entire lives. From stories told at our bedside, to religious texts, to blockbuster films, to an endless supply of legal dramas, we have been trained to spot good and evil. We all know who the good and bad guys are in the overdose crisis. In a nutshell, Purdue manipulated regulators and physicians to get patients hooked on OxyContin, and then when people started dying with the drug in their systems, Purdue ignored the warning signs, pushed their drug even harder, and made billions in the process. OxyContin devastated a nation and made the Sacklers, one of America's richest families, even richer. Meanwhile, doctors who have been called drug dealers in white coats handed out opioids as if they were candy. They prescribed enough opioids to keep every American medicated around the clock for weeks at a time. And in the story that we have told ourselves over and over again, it's the drug companies and the doctors who have received the lion's share of the blame. But the Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie warns us that there is danger in a single story. The problem, she says, is not that a single story is wrong, so much as it's incomplete. When we tell ourselves incomplete stories, we arrive at incomplete solutions. We've been telling ourselves a single story about the overdose crisis, and in doing so, we've struggled to deal with complexity, to recognize that the good guys do bad and the bad guys do good. We're woefully ill-equipped to critique bad systems, to unpack how an ecology of laws, norms, policies, economics, organizations, and relationships affect the decisions people make. We fail to consider that people do bad things because the systems in which they operate invite bad behavior. If systems are failing us, we can't just eliminate the so-called bad actors. We have to look at the rules of the game. Now, please know, I'm not saying any of this to let Purdue off the hook. There is a whole archive's worth of evidence that they did the bad things that these stories claim. But instead, I say this to urge us to think about the bigger picture. My hope is that the OIDA archive can help us do just that. That future researchers will not just look into the archive to paint a more detailed picture of the story that we already know, but that they'll also use the archive to think about other similar cases, that they'll do the comparative work necessary to build theory across social problems and create policy and practice that prevents this kind of tragedy from ever happening again. I'm going to provide some findings from my own research to offer an example of how we might contextualize a social problem. But first, let's consider the broader social context in which the contemporary overdose crisis occurred. The overdose crisis is both a devastating tragedy for people whose loved ones are caught in its grip and a constructed social problem shaped by institutional power dynamics that affect how we define and respond to this issue. In other words, the overdose crisis and our approaches to confronting it are distinctly cultural phenomena. Contemporary approaches to the overdose crisis are dominated by two fields, healthcare and criminal justice, that bring very different tactics, worldviews, and resources to bear, and that are independently inadequate to address a problem of this magnitude. My research examines how these disparate fields tackle the same social problem and how they do so against the backdrop of four cultural touchstones. The first is professional constraints in the US healthcare system. Which is a system in which profit often takes precedence over patient care. Over the last few decades, we've seen the rise of managed care and the rise of big business in medicine, where physicians make decisions under significant pressure to perform efficiently, and that's true for every member of the healthcare team. The second is the interplay between organizational fields. So organizational fields are organizations that in the aggregate belong to a specific branch of society. Criminal justice and medicine are fields, as are religion, art, and education. What holds fields together and what distinguishes them from one another are their core principles. These are what sociologists call institutional logics. So for example, to just put it in very stark terms, criminal justice operates on a logic of punishment, healthcare operates on a logic of treatment. So you can see that there's a lot of room for these kinds of logics to come into conflict. When faced with a social problem, issues like crime, illness, and poverty, each field brings its own perspective, offers its own solutions, and fights to have those solutions realized. How we treat social problems depends quite a bit on which field gets to own the problem and gets to kind of drive the solutions that we're attempting to address with it. However, not all fields are created equal. Some exert significantly more power than others. Today, one of the most powerful fields is criminal justice, which brings us to our third touchstone, the criminalization of social problems. The United States began to experience a punitive turn in the 1970s, a time during which the logics of crime and criminality began to overshadow logics of care and rehabilitation. Since that time, we've seen the criminalization of all kinds of things, from poverty to homelessness, to HIV/AIDS, to immigration. Not only do we turn to the criminal justice system to solve problems, we also increasingly turn to tech. The fourth touchstone is the rise of the digital age, in which unprecedented computing power has made it possible to gather, store, and analyze mountains of data, and to deploy algorithms that make data analysis and decision-making easy and automatic. As a result, we've been allocating many of the decisions about resources and punishment that once belonged to humans to technology. And it's in this context that healthcare and law enforcement have joined forces to stop the opioid crisis. In the process, the lines between these two social fields have become blurry. It's become popular for communities to adopt an all-hands-on-deck approach that incorporates law enforcement, healthcare, and public health. But these three fields don't always work together particularly well. So there's been a lot of focus on how the criminal justice system has taken over healthcare work. Police chiefs like to say things like addiction is a disease and we can't arrest our way out of a problem. Many police departments have started carrying naloxone, a drug overdose antidote, and police-assisted recovery initiatives in which police connect patients to treatment have gained traction. And drug courts, in which a judge decides whether a client has completed treatment, have proliferated. However, there has been decidedly less attention to how the healthcare system has taken over criminal justice work. And that's where my research comes in. I study how the implementation of a criminal justice technology in healthcare affects doctors, pharmacists, and patients. One way that lawmakers have tried to reduce overdose deaths is by implementing prescription drug monitoring programs, or PDMPs. PDMPs are surveillance technologies that track all of the controlled substances in a state, and then they feed that aggregated data, it's aggregated pharmacy data, to healthcare providers who can use it to track patients, and to enforcement agents who can use it to track both providers and patients. So the PDMP is a two-tiered surveillance technology. In the book, I argue that PDMPs are Trojan horse technologies. So if you think back to the myth of the Trojan horse, one thing to keep in mind is that the Trojans were horse people. They were really kind of crazy for horses. So that's why the Trojan horse was such an appealing gift. You know, they saw this gift, they thought, oh yes, that's us, we're horse people. They wheeled it behind their walls, and they never suspected that hiding inside were Greeks who wanted to kill them. Now, the PDMP works the same way, but without all of the death and destruction. Physicians already use a host of technologies, so adding one more seems reasonable. The PDMP looks a lot like the electronic health record, but it is not the same. What they don't realize is that PDMPs are embedded with enforcement logics that emerge through daily practice. PDMP use reorients healthcare providers towards surveillance and enforcement. Now, the other reason that PDMPs are so appealing is because the enforcement environment surrounding medicine has grown more treacherous, and in a couple of different ways. So the main law, David already mentioned this, the main law that governs opioids is the Federal Controlled Substances Act of 1970, and it requires physicians to prescribe in good faith, which means for an established patient and a legitimate medical purpose. In the past, it was really difficult for law enforcement to assess physicians' prescribing practices. That's not true anymore. In 2006, the Drug Enforcement Administration created what are called tactical diversion squads that focus specifically on healthcare crimes. And the PDMP gives enforcement agents access to fine-grained information about physicians' prescribing habits and about pharmacies' dispensing habits. The other big change that you're probably all aware of is that in 2016, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention established a set of guidelines for treating pain, including a recommendation to keep patients at or below 90 morphine milligram equivalents. The guidelines were almost immediately treated as if they were law by healthcare leaders, insurance companies, and lawmakers. So this is the cultural, legal, and technological environment in which physicians practice today. They've been blamed for the worst drug crisis in US history. They have a law enforcement surveillance tool at their disposal. Law enforcement has gotten better at watching their every move, and the CDC has issued guidelines that have been interpreted as law. So I was really interested in how this broader context shaped how physicians made decisions about opioid provision. So I went out to find out how this was all working, and I interviewed 3 types of physicians: primary care providers, both internists and family medicine doctors, pain specialists, and emergency medicine doctors. This is part of a much larger study that I conducted in which I interviewed 337 physicians, pharmacists, and enforcement agents that I write about in the book. But for today, I am just going to talk with you about the physician data. So this is 37 interviews with physicians. I selected 3 states based on different locations of the PDMP: California, where it's in the Department of Justice; Florida, where it's in the Board of Health. And I originally selected Missouri as my negative case because Missouri was the only state without a PDMP at the time. And then they got one that they kind of stitched together county by county. And now we have a statewide PDMP. But regardless, all of the iterations of Missouri's PDMP have been in the Department of Public Health. So it maintains this maximum variation sample strategy. I learned that one of the biggest challenges that physicians face is deciding which patients are deserving and undeserving of care. Now, they don't really use this language. Sociologists use this language, but it's kind of clear that this is the decision that they're trying to make. There are three types of patients who might come looking for opioids: those in pain, those with a substance use disorder, and those who are looking to divert their medications to sell them into illegal markets. And of course, there's crossover. So you might be in pain and selling your drugs. You might have a substance use disorder and also be in pain. So it's complicated. And that's why physicians have a really hard time telling the difference between these three patients. And that's a big part of why they find the PDMP so helpful. They can only legally dispense opioids to patients who are using it for pain, but then they've got to kind of sort through in a very limited time what kind of patient they're dealing with. All three types of physicians I interviewed police patients, but they do it in different and interrelated ways that I'll show you. Physicians police patients when they use enforcement tools to determine whether a patient deserves opioids. The choice is as much moral as it is medical. Physicians find opioid patients difficult to treat. So one pain specialist that I talked with told me that these patients are quote unquote emotional vampires because they require a lot of time listening and negotiating. So patients have to prove that they're worth the trouble. Physicians have become very conservative about opioids, and today's physicians take several precautions to ensure that they're treating only those patients deemed deserving in the eyes of the law. So the first precaution is limiting the patients they see. Many physicians take only those patients that they think are good candidates for opioids, but also who they think can follow the rules. The second precaution physicians take is establishing the rules of engagement. So it's become very common for physicians to require patients to sign a pain contract that is a legalistic document that sets restrictions around their care. Standard pain contracts limit the patient to one physician and one pharmacy. They require them to submit to urine drug screens and state that they will not go to the emergency department to get opioids. Any violation of this contract can result in termination from the practice. Darren, who's an internist in Kansas City, said to me, it's good to lay out all the rules because then when somebody's breaking the rules, you can look back at it and say, look, you're not following the rules. And if you don't, people will be like, oh, well, I didn't know. The third precaution physicians take is tightly monitoring patients. If the pain contract sets the rules of engagement, then PDMP reports, urine drug screens, and random pill counts are enforcement tools that ensure that the patient follows the rules. Says Don, a family medicine physician in Southern California, addicts will tell you anything to get their drug of choice. Enforcement tools serve as lie detector tests that prove the patient deserving or not. The deserving patient receives opioids, and then the questionable or undeserving patient faces further scrutiny. Physicians first respond to troubling news. So troubling news might be something like their urine drug screen shows illegal drugs in their system, or they've looked the patient up in the PDMP and they seem to be going to a lot of different doctors. So when they get this news, they sit the patient down for a talk. They tell me they present the patient with the evidence, and then they give the patient a chance to explain. Kristen tells her patients, we check this drug monitoring program, and it says that you're getting opioids from at least 2 other doctors. You've gotten them while you were under an agreement with me, and that's just not a situation we can allow. Physicians' second response is to ramp up policing. They check the PDMP and screen patients' urine more often, or they require them to submit to random pill counts, where basically they say to the patient, show up at my office within 48 hours, and I'm going to count the number of pills that are remaining in your bottle. And I just want you to, for a minute, imagine us treating any other kind of patient like that. Imagine someone counting your pills for your heart medication. We just don't treat patients this way. And the reason is because both pain and addiction are incompletely medicalized. They kind of sit on the cusp of sickness and badness, something we talk more about certainly. So Gerard, who's a Florida pain specialist, told me he uses random pill counts, quote, for people we're unable to really get a handle on. Unfortunately, he says, it becomes a sting operation, with Gerard and his partners asking, how do we get them? When physicians decide they can't trust the patients with opioids and the patient's on a high dose, the physician tapers them down. Danielle is a St. Louis pain specialist, and she tells the patient, since you're getting medication from multiple providers, we're going to talk about weaning you. I don't want to give you any more medication that I can't trace. Are you selling it to your friends? Are you giving it to kids on the street? You can see the legalistic and the criminal justice language that kind of makes its way into the way physicians talk. The idea of a sting operation, presenting them with the evidence, giving them things they can't trace. These are all things we think of law enforcement talking about. So to an outsider, tapering sounds easy, but those who've been through it say it's a grueling process that provokes all of the symptoms of withdrawal: anxiety, diarrhea, body cramps. I mean, it's really awful. So it's no wonder that people try so hard to avoid it. Some physicians don't even taper. They just refuse to prescribe. Colin says he investigates patients when he spots red flags. If they're truly shopping around, I say, look, I don't want any part of this. I'll see you for your hypertension, but I'm not going to give you opioids anymore. In the most extreme cases, physicians fire patients. Kristen had a patient on a pain contract who kept getting opioids in the emergency department. She considered them a risk. So she said to them, I feel like your behavior would demonstrate that you will potentially be found dead of an overdose, so I cannot in good conscience write you medication. Policing patients helps physicians distinguish between deserving and undeserving patients and keep deserving patients in line. It also shields physicians from law enforcement. Policing patients is a form of defensive documentation that creates a paper trail. So it shows that the physician did everything possible to ensure that the patient had a legitimate need for the opioid. That means surveilling patients and following the CDC guidelines. Physicians tell me they're not afraid of law enforcement. I asked them, I was like, you're monitoring patients using this technology. Do you think that law enforcement is monitoring you? And they told me, I don't know, but I don't really care because I'm doing everything right. So they're not afraid of law enforcement because they're policing patients themselves. The deserving patient has to run a gauntlet to get opioids, but they still fare better than the undeserving patient. So the undeserving patient is either a deserving patient who falls from grace or a patient who was never deemed worthy in the first place. Patients like these find themselves tossed from one physician to another in a game of hot potato. When faced with a patient deemed undeserving, physicians are caught in a dilemma. They can prescribe opioids and risk legal action, or they can dismiss the patient and fail to help somebody in need. Physicians cope with this impossible situation by passing patients along to other physicians they think can provide better care. And what results is an endless cycle. Everybody's handing the patient off, and so the patient ends up seeking care and getting none. The core tension between general practitioners and pain specialists arises from the question of who is going to prescribe these opioids in the long term. General practitioners believe that pain specialists should be the ones to provide opioids because chronic pain falls within their scope of expertise. Pain specialists think that general practitioners should manage opioids since they prefer to spend their time doing procedures. So things like epidural steroid injections and nerve blocks that are fast and lucrative compared to opioid providing, which is slow and unprofitable. At her internal medicine practice in San Francisco, Seema sometimes inherits patients who are already on opioids. When this happens, she uses a common strategy. She tells the patient she's going to prescribe for 3 months, but then they have to go to pain management. Seema's expectation is that the pain management physician is going to taper that patient. Pain specialists balk at this kind of scenario. In their eyes, general practitioners are dumping undesirable patients on them. So Scott, who works in private practice, feels backed into a corner by general practitioners who promise patients that he will do something that he won't. The primary care says, I don't write for opiates, the pain specialist does. So then they come to me with that expectation, and I want them like I want a frickin' hole in the head. Pain specialists are specialists above all, and they expect to be treated that way. So Jennifer, who works at a hospital in Kansas City, doesn't consider opioid treatment unique to her specialty. She says, we aren't any more equipped to prescribe opioids than anyone else just because we're pain management. Pain specialists have their own strategies for avoiding dumps from primary care. Some, like Scott, simply refuse to treat the patient. I don't want them, he says. I tell them I'm not taking you on. I mean, I see all kinds of red flags. You're on benzodiazepines, your urine's dirty from marijuana, you're not showing up to work. Patients respond, well, what am I supposed to do, doc? I have one pill left and my primary care doc won't write for me. Scott tells them, I don't know, and walks out, leaving the patient, in his words, irate. When primary care providers and pain specialists refuse to see patients, the patient often ends up in the emergency department. Emergency medicine physicians don't think that chronic pain is an emergency. They expect patients to be established with either a general practitioner or a pain specialist who prescribes their opioids. Still, there are some emergency medicine physicians who acknowledge just how hard it is to get opioids from these other two kinds of doctors. Matt says he's stuck in a pickle, asking whether he should give the patient more meds. He finds the PDMP, quote unquote, exceedingly helpful in these cases. He looks up the patient, and if he sees no red flags, he might try to get them help. But patients still get stuck, especially if they don't have insurance. He goes on to explain, I think patient abandonment is a big issue because then it pushes them back in my lap. From general practice to pain medicine to emergency medicine and back again, patients are trapped in an endless loop. Physicians have learned a lot about opioids in the last decade, and they're genuinely concerned about doing more harm than good. However, the tools that are available to them push them towards enforcement. Like the mythic Trojan horse that distracted the horse-loving Trojans with its shape, enforcement tools have the same contours as healthcare tools. However, these tools also have a pernicious quality that becomes evident when we see patients policed out of treatment and shuffled between practitioners. Forced to straddle the line between treatment and enforcement, physicians police patients and call it care. The terrible irony is that there is no evidence to suggest that cutting down prescribing the way these doctors are doing is going to reduce overdose deaths. In fact, rejecting, tapering, and abandoning patients is likely to result in more deaths rather than fewer. Prescribing rates have been going down since 2012, even as overdose rates have been skyrocketing. And that's because cutting down the legal drug supply has steered people towards the illegal drug market that is teeming with deadlier drugs like fentanyl and increasingly xylazine. Fentanyl contributed to 66% of overdose deaths in 2021, prescription opioids 16%. Beyond that, some subset of pain patients have taken their own lives when the chronic pain became unbearable. This is Doug Hale, who was first prescribed opioids in 2001 after he started to experience bladder inflammation due to a surgery. He tried all kinds of interventions, but opioids were the only thing that helped. His pain was well managed until his primary care physician decided to taper him. He gave him 1 month to get off of his opioids completely, which is a very fast taper. And he tried detox, which didn't work. And when he returned to his doctor asking for opioids, the doctor told him, I'm not going to risk my license for you. The next day, he shot himself in his backyard. In the note he left for his wife, he said, I can't take the chronic pain anymore. He was 53 years old. Stories like Doug's bring into sharp focus the real human cost of anti-opioid policy and why we need to get this exactly right. My research shows that law enforcement has moved more deeply into healthcare. Doctors and pharmacists are acting like cops, and patients have nowhere to turn. Despite all of this, we're still losing over 100,000 of our loved ones every single year. It's critical to remind ourselves that what lies at the root of the overdose crisis is human suffering, and that success is measured in how much we help those who are hurting. I think we can all agree that allowing corporations to profit from harm for decades and then trying to claw back those ill-gotten gains is terrible public health policy. Didn't work for tobacco, it's not going to work for opioids. And I don't say that to downplay the hard work that so many people have done to expose Purdue and other companies and hold them accountable. I say that because we too often try to address social problems in isolation without addressing related problems or getting to the root of the problem. That siloed approach has not served us. And at the same time, the all hands on deck approach comes with its own set of challenges. We're not going to get out of this crisis by turning doctors into cops. Blurring the boundaries between healthcare and law enforcement changes the very nature of healthcare work and puts patients like Doug at risk. We need better solutions, and finding them starts with telling ourselves a better story, one that goes beyond the bad pharmaceutical companies and the doctors who enabled them. We have to tell ourselves a story that accounts for the broad social factors that shaped this crisis, from social decline to diminishing professional power, to the rampant criminalization of social problems, to the rise of the digital age. We have to consider the needs of people in pain and people with substance use disorders who have been pitted against each other in a zero-sum fight over opioids. And we have to develop solutions that incorporate prevention, treatment, and harm reduction. By prevention, I want to be clear, I mean capital P prevention, which is taking the steps necessary to make our communities impervious to those who seek to harm them. That means we have to fortify our social safety net by making sure that people have access to education, jobs, housing, healthcare, and education and mental health support that they need to thrive. And when people fall, and they inevitably will, we have to have the treatment and harm reduction infrastructure in place to catch them. That is how we save ourselves. And we have to keep our eye on the horizon for future problems. We can safeguard our future by critically examining our past. So several of the panelists a couple of days ago mentioned that sunlight is the greatest disinfectant. But sunlight does more than kill germs. It allows things to grow, and we reap what we sow. What seeds are we planting now to help our communities thrive in the future? The OIDA archive offers a useful place to start. It will help us critically examine the past and set a path for our future. So thank you for your attention. I'd like to thank the National Science Foundation Career Award in Sociology and Law and Science, the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, and the St. Louis Office of the Vice President for Research for supporting my work. And if you'd like to learn more, my book, Policing Patients, comes out in September. All right, thank you all.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. We are going to move into discussion, which can include questions to all our panelists. And I already have several in our Q&A, so hang on one second and I will bring them forward. So, and of course, some of these may be answered and discussed by others, you know, beyond the people that they were directed to. But let's get started with some specific ones. So, Professor Lentacker, are there features of other archives that you like a lot that you think OIDA should prioritize for emulation?
Well, I think the archive is pretty unique in gathering these millions of litigation documents. There are very specific challenges related to that, and I don't know that I have an obvious archive to compare it with. And certainly there's smaller improvements that can be made and make OIDA a little bit less clunky. If I have to think a little bit more broadly about other kinds of archive, I mean, there's one that is really interesting, is actually built by a colleague of mine here in the department, is an archive of enslaved persons that have been brought across the Atlantic over the course of the several centuries of the slave trade. It's called enslaved.org, and one thing it does is very interesting is it's an archive, but it's also a database, and every enslaved person whose name is known or shows in the records can be searched in the database, and then the database also links to the particular archives where those records are. I mean, not all the records are inside enslaved.org, but what it does is kind of weaving this web of links to other archives, and it just kind of maps out the general landscape of records that are out there. And I think something comparable would be, of course, extraordinarily valuable in the case of OIDA, as David explained too. There's other, OIDA is very rich, but there are other archives, and And if we could imagine a way to point researchers who are working with the archive to those other archives and kind of weave the various archives of the opioid crisis together, that of course would be, I think, sort of a very promising, a very interesting goal to work towards. So.
May I ask, if just for clarification, so are you also thinking about linking the lived experience of particular people who are affected to, is that what you're thinking when you're describing that? Because I'm hearing that thread, and
I think that probably is, would probably involve another layer of rethinking or restructuring of the archive. I don't know. Right now, I don't see a path quite to convert those litigation documents into a source for that particular enterprise of an archive structured around the names of victims. I think that's a pretty interesting prospect for a way to archive and then think about the opioid epidemic. I think it's perhaps a bit less restructuring would be just finding some way to link or to build inside the archive itself links to other archives, other repositories that might help fill the gaps that that do exist in OIDA. So.
I know this is obviously linked to comments that you also had, David. Did you want to comment on this question as well about thinking about how the archive itself could be organized or future possibilities?
Well, I outlined some relative areas of weakness in terms of, the quantity of documents with respect to distributors or pharmacy benefit managers. I've been thinking hard as I've been listening, and I don't see any reason why you couldn't, for example, include digitized oral history interviews, assuming, of course, you had the permission of both the interviewer and the interviewee. I think there are all kinds of linkages that are possible, even probable. But the main thing right now, from my perspective as an historian, is to get more material in, especially early material. That's the most important gap in the collection right now.
Thank you for addressing that. The next question is for Liz. This is a general question, and then I have a specific one for you as well. But are there any good news for patients in this narrative that you laid out, or do they just consistently get the short end of the stick?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think right now they do consistently get the short end of the stick. We've had, and I think David did a really nice job of laying this out. We have had this policy pendulum swinging back and forth for over 120 years now, where we've had these very liberal moments where opioids were readily available, to moments where they weren't available for almost anyone, and then they were available again, and now we're cracking down again, right? So we're just kind of going back and forth and back and forth. But I don't think we've really found the solution to dealing with chronic pain. And I think that's really where we need to focus. There's a lot of focus on, for example, trying to create a non-addictive opioid, but I think there's an over focus on drugs as the solution to dealing with pain. And of course, pain is more complicated. It's not just physiological, it's also mental, it's also social and contextual. And so I think we need to be thinking more broadly about how we prevent people from getting into pain and how we address pain. And I think there are people pushing in that direction. I think the fight being over one particular type of drugs does not serve us. We actually have to think more broadly. But yes, right now, I think patients are really struggling.
May I add something to that?
Please do.
In the historical record, this is actually an old problem. In the 1910s, 20s, 30s, there were a number of patients who were quietly maintained on morphine by physicians. And then the physician would retire or die, and the patient was in trouble. It becomes really important to you as a patient to have a secure connection, whether it's a black market connection or whether it's a licensed medical practitioner. And if you lose that connection, you're in trouble. But on the other hand, you can get in trouble even if you maintain that connection. Because one of the things about opioid analgesia is that even though it usually works really well initially, it doesn't necessarily work well over a period of 10 or 20 or 30 years. And in fact, you can develop conditions like hyperalgesia where the pain actually becomes worse, or you can reach dosage levels where you are inherently in danger simply because of the very large amounts you're taking on a daily basis. And statistically, those are the people who are more likely to overdose. So even if you maintain your medical supply, you're not guaranteed of a happy outcome. I mean, the person who shot himself in his backyard, that's a tragic story, but so is the person who's on 200 MME and overdoses and dies dead is dead.
Just to respond to that, I mean, yes, they're all tragic stories. And I think that's where the new legal environment in which physicians are practicing is wholly problematic, because the idea that you've had people on these really high MMEs for a long time, or a physician in the community retires who had a lot of patients on high MMEs, and then these newer physicians are like, oh no, I can't have these patients, and they immediately taper them. The fast taper is also really dangerous. And so what we need is for physicians to actually be able to effectively treat these patients. And that might be over a period of 5 or 10 years where they're going back and forth, trying a lot of different things. Immediately saying to a patient, you've got 30 days to go from 200 MME to 50 MME isn't fair to anybody, and that's a recipe for disaster. And so I agree, there are challenges with long-term opioid prescribing, but there are also challenges with just cutting patients off.
So relatedly, there's another question for you. Your argument for Liz, for your argument that since oversupply has gone down and deaths are continuing to rise, and that this isn't a prescription drug problem is fairly problematic. There are well-described analyses that explain this, including a wealth of evidence of the lag between exposure and harms, as well as the reservoir of 2+ million individuals that have active opioid use disorder, most of whom would not, but for historic opioid oversupply, as discussed by our keynote. So tell us a little bit more about this.
Yes, so I want to be clear. I'm trying really hard not to talk in terms of black and white. You know, I'm not saying we never had a prescription opioid problem, or we don't still have a prescription opioid problem. What I am saying is we have to think about the broader context in which we've had this overuse of drugs, and then we have to think about what the backlash has meant for patients. And so I would have a very hard time believing that all 2 million people who have substance use disorders got them from a pain medication and then transitioned, and that's why we're losing over 100,000 people every year. People are hooked on drugs for all kinds of reasons. There are people who are hooked on drugs who have never touched a prescription drug. And so I think we have to deal with and think about those complexities. Is there a lag effect? I mean, is it that we had this huge oversupply of prescription opioids and now we have a fentanyl problem? And if I were to say those things are entirely unrelated, yes, that would be problematic, and that's not what I'm saying. But it's also not the case that everyone who's dying of fentanyl now was originally prescribed OxyContin. And so and I've asked that question for years, and David, maybe you actually have an answer to it. I've always wondered, how many people are iatrogenically addicted to opioids through their physician, and how many people get hooked on them through some other mechanism? I've never seen a hard number about that. But yes, I think even if it were true, and I'm not convinced it is, but even if it were true that all of those people were originally hooked on OxyContin, we don't get out of the problem by stopping doctors from prescribing prescription medications right now. Some people need opioids in some circumstances, and we have to contend with that. But we also have to deal with the fentanyl overdose. My doctor not prescribing me OxyContin or Vicodin doesn't suddenly make somebody not die of a fentanyl overdose. We have to deal with the problem we have and anticipate the problems we're going to have steps down the line, and not create more problems by cutting off people who are well managed on their medication.
No
So a
comment on that,
couple,
David.
yeah, a couple of quick points in response. Again, you have to go back to that distinction between direct and indirect iatrogenesis. It's often the case that the doctor will be responsible and the patient will be perfectly compliant, and yet those pills will find their way into the hands of 19 and 20-year-olds at a party. And so, as you said, there are many roads to abuse and addiction. The other thing is, if you ask, well, what started the addiction, it's entirely time dependent. I mean, historians deal with change over time. If you ask me about somebody who initiated opioid use in 2009 and had developed the symptoms of addiction by, say, 2011, I would say you're talking about somebody who's using prescription opioids in all probability. If you ask me about somebody who becomes addicted in, say, 2020, early 2020, not necessarily, because what happened was that per capita prescribing peaked in the first quarter of 2011, and then it began a gradual decline and then a more precipitous decline after the CDC guidelines in 2016. So unless you specify a time period, it's not really possible to answer that question. I will tell you, by way of concluding, though, that, that in my home city of Jacksonville, Florida, if you walked into a methadone treatment program in, say, 2010 or 2011, or any other kind of agonist-based treatment program, and you called yourself a heroin addict, you were like an old-time weirdo, right? Because it had shifted that dramatically. Oh, it's one of those old heroin addicts, you know, who's somehow washed up in Jacksonville, and we're going to put the person on methadone. Now it's completely different. So drug fashions come and go. Like money, drugs are fungible. And if you are a daily dependent user, you will find something that will prevent you from getting dope sick.
Please go ahead, Antoine.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question too for Liz. And so, you know, I should say first that as I said, I came fairly late to the opioid epidemic, and I didn't know about your work, Liz, and it's really great. It strikes me as a great example of, I mean, as you said, and in various ways we all spoke about the need to move beyond, you know, this kind of black and white. You know, the framing of the story, or you know, merely sort of moving beyond the question of bad actors, and you know, PDNPs are. This is very interesting because for instance, in doing some research, I didn't focus very much on PDNP when I looked at the Mallinckrodt documents, but certainly, so they're based in Missouri, and I did see some documents about discussions regarding the creation of a PDNP in Missouri, and obviously opioid companies are very, you know, hostile to PDNPs, and they're hostile also to imposing too many restrictions on pain patients. And so I can see how this is typically a story, you know, how your scholarship might be appropriated by the opioid industry, somehow it might be made to fit their purpose, and indeed the complexity of your work. You know, I mean, I can see it, you know, it elicits this response, perhaps, that, you know, are you not somehow, you know, advocating against restrictions and therefore doing the bidding of drug companies? So I'd be really interested in hearing what it's been like as a, you know, a scholar trying to advance those more complex arguments, and how often you do run into, you know, there's objections or the difficulties to try to make a complex argument when, you know, the lines are so clearly drawn.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great question. And I think, you know, just like David was talking about how drugs come in and out of vogue, the people whose side you're on comes in and out of vogue. And right now it is very unfashionable to say, what about the pain patients? It's very unfashionable. And the first question is that. Now, I've never gotten it before. So you're raising it, and this is the first chance to really kind of grapple with it. To be clear, I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. You know, the drug companies are not in the habit of funding sociologists. But even if they were, that's not where I get my funding. My funding comes from the National Science Foundation. But But we do have to talk about the pain patients. And I think that's the mistake that we've made over the last 100 years. We act as if we can either care about people with substance use disorder or we can care about people in pain, but we can't possibly care about both. But I think we can have enough compassion for both of these groups, and I think we can find solutions that work for both of these groups. I think they are being pitted against each other when, in fact, and this is going to be very unpopular, I think they are often the same people who are expressing pain in different ways. You know, chronic pain is often of no known origin. And substance use disorder comes from all kinds of different origins. There's a lovely book out right now called The Prescription to Prison Pipeline by another sociologist, Michelle Smirnova, that really gets at the heart of how pain helps to drive a lot of these issues, and then how people who are taking opioids to deal with pain end up in prison, and why it looks like that. And so no, I have not gotten the "are you a shill for the opioid companies?" But it is a good question about are my arguments useful to them? Certainly, I don't think the prescription drug monitoring program is going away. And so I don't think there's a lot we can do to kind of get rid of it. But I do think that it's problematic to put a lot of enforcement tools in our physicians' toolkits and not give them the healthcare tools that they actually need to treat their patients. You never meet a physician who's like, "Oh yeah, I'm going into medicine because what I really want to do is surveil and police my patients." They go into medicine because they want to help people, and we have to give them the tools to do that. And I'm skeptical that the PDMP is the tool that's going to make that happen. Could we transform it into a different kind of tool? Potentially, but that requires the wraparound of a lot of other resources that physicians, for the most part, do not have.
This is a great discussion. I have one, not that small question, but I think a really important one. And I just want to bring in, and then I'll hand it over to Jason to wrap up. There is a belief that African Americans do not feel pain the same way as white Americans among other members of the medical community. Obviously, this is a false perception. How can we prevent this kind of racial bias from affecting the new policing of pain medication and prevent them from being seen as drug seeking? I just wanted to make sure we have that in our discussion.
It's a great question. And, Dorothy Roberts, who is a sociologist, writes about that. She writes about that in Killing the Black Body. She's written about that in other territory. These kind of racialized ideas about pain have driven who gets access and who doesn't get access. And I think the problem with the overprescribing opioid narrative is that we assume that all opioids are too much. But really, if we break it down into these different groups, and David mentioned this too, some people have not gotten enough treatment and other people have gotten too much treatment. And so I think a lot of that has to do with training and education, but also, but that's not the only solution. I think we also have to culturally think more concretely and more kindly about pain.
And there's a class and gender element to that as well. There's a very good book by Martin Pernick called A Calculus of Suffering, which traces these ideas back to the 19th century. And if you were male, and especially if you were a working class male, and even more especially if you were a working class African-American male, it was assumed that you were relatively more impervious to pain.
Thank you so much. I think that was just such an important topic that I just want to make sure we capture that in our discussion and didn't want to run out of time completely. So I'm going to hand it over to Jason to close us out.
All right, thanks all. This was a great conversation, great talks, and I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us today and for the entire session, all the sessions, excuse me, for the entire symposium. And I hope this was as insightful as it was for me, as insightful for you as it was for me. So with that, I want to say thank you, have a nice weekend, and please visit the OIDA site for these recordings and, for any of the materials that you want to use in your own research and classes, and obviously touch base with the OIDA team if you have any questions. With that, take care and bye.